but it became increasingly apparent that the airlift was going to be successful. And, it's a bit like the story in Ukraine at the moment. The West could not be seen to fail in this. This was absolutely imperative that they kept Berlin alive.
Hello and welcome to the Aspects of History podcast. My name is Oliver Webb-Carter and I'm the editor and your host. In the second part of my chat with Giles Milton on Berlin after the war, we talk about some of the characters involved in the story, and then the main event of the period, the Berlin Airlift, which I nearly neglected to bring up and which Giles helpfully reminded me. Now, there are also a few similarities with today's great West-East struggle in Ukraine, as European and US governments are keen to assist Ukraine in its fight with the Russian invaders, so Giles gives some of his thoughts there too. Now, Giles has also written about a subject that is about to see an important anniversary this year, and which has similarities with Berlin and indeed Ukraine. In 1922, in Smyrna, Turkey, now Izmir, tens of thousands of people were killed and many women raped as Turkish forces entered the city. All the links we discuss are in the show notes, and you'll find timings on there as well. Now, the new Aspects of History magazine is out now, and you can read about subjects such as prison camps and their inmates on the Isle of Man during World War II, an interview with Stephen Saylor, the best-selling historical fiction writer, and there's a piece on our historical hero for the issue, George Washington, by David O. Stewart, guest on the show. So do head over to our website and find out more. Finally, if you can subscribe or even give me a nice review, I'd be massively grateful. I hope you enjoy my discussion with Giles on Berlin after the war. So Ernest Bevin, wow, what a man. I mean, I didn't really know that. I haven't read much about him apart from in your book. So he's just this sort of larger than life man of the left, but hates communism, fascinating man.
He is a fascinating man. He was the one person when he came back to the Potsdam Conference as the representative of the new Labour government, Churchill having been sent home. And one of his famous phrases was, "I'm not going to have Britain barged about," he said. And had he been there from the beginning, I think he was so pugnacious and so, really punchy that he might have been able to push Stalin around a bit. But alas, by the time he came back to the conference for its second half, I think it was too late for him to do anything. But he is an amazing character. I mean, his secretary said he guzzled alcohol as a car guzzles petrol. He smoked, he drank, he was combative, he was argumentative. And in one notable conference that was held in Paris, he got so infuriated with Molotov, with whom he was engaged in an argument, that he actually got up with his fists drawn and was prepared to punch Molotov in the face. And he had to be pulled away, actually, which I think was a rather wonderful moment in this international conference.
I can't imagine Douglas Hurd or Margaret Beckett doing something like that. That's fantastic. So whilst he understood the lay of the land, really, what about Clement Attlee? Was he in a slightly different, what was his view of the Russians?
I think it was really Bevin because Bevin was so on the ball when it came to foreign policy and so in control of foreign policy that he was really dictating events on the ground. Not only did he read the situation very well and the dangers faced by the West inside Berlin and in Western Germany, but he also realized that the entire the security structure of Europe had changed. If Stalin was no longer an ally, then that posed a question that we have two opposing camps, basically. And from the very beginning, he was looking at the structural architecture of Europe in the aftermath, in the immediate aftermath of the war, and he begins to plan for the establishment of what would become NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is basically to guarantee the future safety of Western Europe by bringing all these nations together and famously declaring that an attack on one was an attack on all. This was the one way that Bevin and others saw that they could preserve the peace in Western Europe, because it was based on the principle that the Soviet Union would never attack one nation if it saw this overwhelming force ranged against it.
Well, it's so interesting because obviously we're seeing Ukraine today, but the Russian reaction to NATO being set up was this is a terrible act of aggression against us, and with Ukraine today, you see the Russians are any move at all, which are effectively defensive measures, are viewed as terrible acts of aggression against them. It's I guess an echo slightly of where we are.
Do you know what? When I wrote this book, I thought I was writing a work of history.
Oh, you timed the paperback release perfectly, yes.
And now, I mean, with the absolutely terrible events going on in Ukraine, you literally see history repeating itself. I mean, when I saw what had taken place in Bucha, north of Kiev, you see, the looting, the rape, the atrocities that have been committed. I mean, this is straight out of the playbook of the Red Army in 1945. This is exactly what they did, when they entered Berlin. This whole idea of denazification of Ukraine, a total absurdity, but Putin knows that this word denazification has a very powerful sort of imagery inside Russia, and you're right to say the whole NATO. A couple of years ago, NATO seemed like a spent force, especially when Trump was president. Now, of course, we're all talking about NATO, and it's a new renaissance for NATO. And this takes us right back to, I think, Colonel Frank Howley, he said repeatedly that the only language the Russians will ever understand is the language of force, and that they will never dare attack Western Europe if the nations form themselves into an organization, a defensive alliance, basically, because they know that they can't win, and they will never fight if they think they can't win. And so I think, you really get a sense of sort of deja vu when you see what's taking place now and what took place in 1945.
So I was interested in your view on this, actually. Do you think that the Allies have not been as strong as they should have been against Putin's Russia? Or the West, I'd probably describe us as.
I think the problems for Ukraine really begin with the West's pathetic response to the annexation of the Crimea in 2014, that we in the West did absolutely nothing. And that made Putin think, well, I think I can get away with slightly more. I've taken one bite, I'll take an even bigger bite, But something did happen in the meantime. Something very important happened in the meantime. And that was that the West, particularly America, began actively training the Ukrainian army. The Ukrainian army in 2014 was a pretty hopeless force. It has transformed itself in the intervening years, which is why we're seeing it fighting so effectively, far more effectively, it should be said, than the numerically superior Russian army.
Well, heading back to 1946, because there is a little bit of an echo, because with the establishment of NATO, that meant that American isolationism, which had obviously not been during the war, but that they were forgetting about isolationism for the foreseeable future with the establishment of NATO. I guess nowadays the Americans are having to think seriously about that again. But so we have NATO established, and then the Kommandatura sort of rather collapses, doesn't it?
Yeah, we've actually slightly jumped ahead of ourselves here because we need to step back a bit, because NATO, of course, was established in 1949. So all a lot of the drama that is taking place in Berlin actually takes place before this, and really the establishment of NATO is in many ways a reaction to a massive sort of standoff and that's going to take place in Berlin with the blockade, and then of course the Berlin Airlift. So I don't know, maybe we should.
Yeah, that's quite important. You should mention that. Yes, the Berlin Airlift, or the blockade. And what we should also talk about, what is a great character in there. Well, I use great as in amusing to read about, but he's a pretty dislikable character. Is the representative of Stalin in Berlin, Walter Ulbricht.
Yes. So one of the plans that Stalin had to try and take over Berlin, to basically kick out the Western Allies and take over the entire city, he had trained up a small band of German communists who'd fled the Third Reich and taken sought exile in Moscow during the war. They'd been trained up and they were going to be dropped back into Berlin at the end of the war and surreptitiously, secretly take over the local administration, the mayor, the town halls inside the various sectors and regions of Berlin. And this is precisely what Walter Ulbricht and his small band of communists they proceeded to do, working on the ground with local mayors inside the city and everything. They began to take over the remnants of the existing sort of organized the structure of the city, if you like, including and most importantly the police force. They brought in a chap called Paul Markgraf, an ex-Nazi turned communist, formidable individual, in fact, who appointed himself really as head of the Berlin police force. So this meant that when the Allies, the Western Allies, when the Americans, Brits and French arrived in Berlin, there was already this sort of network of communists sort of working beneath the surface to try and take control of the city with the active support of the Red Army, who are also, are based in the east of the city.
So as communists, I guess, did they flee before did Ulbricht flee before the war or during the war?
He fled, I think, at the beginning when things turned very difficult for communists in the Third Reich. So early on, he fled to Moscow. He'd spent many years in Moscow. He knew Stalin very well on a personal level, and he was dropped back into Berlin pretty much the same time. I mean, just a couple of days after the Red Army had entered and captured the city. So he was there from the very beginning, making contact with other communists who'd remained in the city underground, working in great danger, it should be said, during the Third Reich. So they were trying to form some sort of structure that they could use to help the Red Army take over the city when the moment came.
And it's interesting because Berlin, of all German cities during the war, was probably, I don't know if it's a great way of describing it, but not the most fervent Nazi city in Germany, but Munich being probably the most pro.
That's right. I mean, if you look at the election results in the elections that preceded the forming of the Third Reich, Berlin voted in a very small percentage for the Nazis. So yes, it was not a natural Nazi stronghold. In fact, it's sort of more open-minded, much more tolerant. And with quite a sizable communist presence actually in the city.
The Kommandantur is on borrowed time, really, isn't it? And that collapses, and then we get the airlift. So yes.
I mean, you have to see the sort of Kommandantur as you read your way through these accounts. It becomes more and more rancorous. It becomes increasingly impossible for any business to be done in the Kommandantur, and it becomes clear to everyone really that the city is really beginning to split into two completely separate parts, with a Soviet-controlled east with its own functioning city government in the east, and in the west as well, likewise a sort of Western-dominated government. What happens? We reach crisis point in June 1948, where there's this standoff in the Kommandantur develops into a full-scale rupture, where the Soviets storm out, and they're not going to have anything more to do with trying to run the city as a whole. And what do? They slap a blockade onto West Berlin. They do what the Americans and Brits have feared all along. They cut the motorway. They cut the rail links into Berlin, and suddenly you have a small garrison of American and British troops in the city, unable to replenish their supplies, unable to bring any food or weaponry, it should be said. And also, they have some 2 million West Berliners in their sectors of the city who have got no food, because Traditionally, Berlin gets all its food from eastern Germany, from Pomerania, from areas like that. These are under control of the Red Army, and the Red Army is not going to allow any supplies into West Berlin. So basically, you have this small area of the city with 2 million people and two major garrisons who can't get any supplies by rail or by road. What are they going to do? They either are going to abandon West Berlin, and this is something that Colonel Howley said, we will never do. He says, I will never, ever leave Berlin. But that begs the question, how on earth are you going to keep this city alive? But West Berlin alone needs a minimum of 4,000 tons of food a day just to keep the people from starvation. Howley says we're going to try and do it by air, and thus begins the famous Berlin Airlift. Most people, including Stalin, think that this is logistically impossible. You know, the planes they have available at the time can carry a maximum, each plane, a maximum of 4 tons of supplies in. They need 4,000 tons a day just to keep the city alive. But the airlift is really one of the most, well, it's the most remarkable sort of episode, I think, in that immediate post-war history. And certainly in the book, it forms a remarkable few chapters of the book, I hope, because what you have this extraordinary effort on the part of the Americans and British to bring in every serviceable plane that they have across the world into West Germany. And these planes are then going to fly all the supplies that are needed into West Berlin. They're going to fly continuously round the clock, flying at 6 different levels, landing every few seconds into Berlin's 2 serviceable airports, bringing in everything that Berliners need. And it is really a quite remarkable achievement.
It really is, and over a winter as well. So the weather conditions must have been very difficult for the pilots.
Exactly. And there are 2 key characters, I think, that are worth sort of flagging up here, because, as I say, most people said logistically this was impossible. But there happened to be in the British sector of Berlin at the time this eccentric sort of boffin, if you like, called Air Marshal Rex White. And he was a mathematical genius, basically. And he looked at what was needed, and he looked at the planes they had available, and he worked out that it was just about mathematically possible to supply West Berlin with the supplies needed if they constructed this sort of amazing timetable of planes, this schedule of planes landing into Berlin. So he said to the Americans, this is actually possible. And the Americans then looked at who could actually command this airlift. And they turned to this extraordinary general he was known as General Tonnage Tunner. And he had spent his war flying in supplies and explosives into Chiang Kai-shek's forces in China during the war, flying a highly dangerous airlift operation over the Himalayas, dropping supplies into the Chinese. The Americans immediately realized he was the world expert in flying in supplies in an airlift situation. And if anyone could do it, General Tunner could do it. So basically, they took Reginald White's sort of blueprint, mathematical blueprint. They gave it to General Tonnage Tunner, and they basically said, get on with it, you know. And Tonnage Tunner did just that. He brought in every available plane from around the world and set in motion the Berlin Airlift, with, I have to say, throughout with the support of Colonel Howley, who was, had sort of very genius ideas like dehydrating fruit and vegetables, bringing it in because it weighed less, all sorts of, little sort of logistical tricks, if you like, which enabled them to keep Berliners alive in these desperate times. And they were desperate times because, as you mentioned, in the autumn and the winter, Berlin is notorious, A, for its fog, and B, for its cold weather, snow, which falls, over much of December, January, February. But they managed to overcome these hurdles and keep the Berlin Airlift going, despite massive provocation from the Soviets, who, it should be said, never dared shoot down the Allied planes, but they did pretty much everything else that they could do to try and thwart the airlift.
It is one of the most amazing achievements. The Russians, did they view this as a sort of humiliation, the fact that they were unable to really isolate Berlin to such an extent that the Allies would leave?
I think they did. I mean, look, they kept up the blockade of Berlin, of West Berlin, for almost a year, but it became increasingly apparent that the airlift was going to be successful. And, it's a bit like the story in Ukraine at the moment. The West could not be seen to fail in this. This was absolutely imperative that they kept Berlin alive. So they threw absolutely everything at it. And I think Stalin realized by the spring of 1949 that the Western Allies were going to make this work, and they were not going to back down. And he gradually, through in the sort of back rooms of power, he began to his diplomats began to talk with the Americans and British diplomats and find a way out, or find a way to climb down from this impossible situation that he put himself in. And gradually, after detailed, complex, and fraught negotiations, the Soviets agreed to lift their blockade and reopen the Autobahn and the railway link into Berlin. And it was seen, it has to be said, by West Berliners and by the West as a whole, as an absolutely triumphant victory. It had been the first battle of the Cold War, and it had been the first victory for the Western powers of the Cold War.
Yeah, it really is the opening, the Cold War starts here, doesn't it? And so with NATO's creation, that's where your book ends. But we then get the wall comes up sort of in 61. So the Soviets are never happy with a kind of the situation that we ended in 51.
Yeah, I think that Berlin is going to be a flashpoint for the entirety of the Cold War, largely because it's the one place where you have the Americans and British and the French facing off against the Soviets. Basically, they are literally face to face inside Berlin. So it really becomes a flashpoint. And I think that a character we should mention who comes in to the book at the time of the blockade and who's incredibly important is the West Berlin mayor, Ernst Reuter, because Ernst Reuter, what he does is basically lift Berlin onto the world stage. He makes it an immensely important issue for the West. And as I said, the West could not be seen to lose in this battle. And that was largely because Ernst Reuter made these powerful speeches in front of several million Berliners, which were then broadcast around the world, saying that, you cannot abandon Berlin. Berlin is a symbol that has to be protected, that if the West is going to win in any shape or form, it has to win in Berlin. So Berlin becomes and will remain throughout the Cold War this potent symbol, this symbol of two entirely different ways of living. You have the cosmopolitan, wealthy West Berlin set against, the misery of life in East Berlin. So I think symbolically, as much as anything else, it becomes incredibly important throughout the entirety of the Cold War, and of course the end of the Cold War and the Berlin Wall being hacked down, being brought down, and the end of the Cold War.
So Reuter's speeches, I guess, are a very effective form of information war, like we're seeing in Ukraine now, where it really does galvanize the whole world to back West Berlin.
Exactly. He really upped the ante, if you like. And while the Americans and British could bring in food and supplies into Berlin, Reuter's role was to uphold the morale of Berliners. This was incredibly important in a siege situation. Berliners were very hungry. They had to hold out, and they didn't know for how long. And you have this orator standing up, delivering these speeches, saying that the West is not going to back down. He really inspires confidence in Berliners, and he is there side by side with Colonel Howley all the way through the blockade of Berlin.
Now, there's an extraordinary picture in the book of him giving his speech with the Reichstag behind him, which looks like it could be 1945 and the Soviets have just left, but it's 4 years after and it's still in a bit of a state.
Yeah, I mean, the city remains in ruins for a considerable time because the city, not only had the Red Army fought their way into the city and caused immense destruction, but of course the RAF and the Americans had been bombing Berlin for the better part of 4 years as well. So the place was in absolute rubble and would remain so. But you're right to mention that photo, because that photo is very striking, not least for the size of the crowd that he's addressing. There were more than 1 million people listening to that speech inside Berlin. And of course, it was then broadcast around the world, and everyone in America and Britain and the West are listening to this speech as well. when you hear that speech, when you hear the powerful oratory that Ernst Reuter uses, you realize why the West simply could not abandon Berlin, that it had to stand by it, and it had to make sure that it was going to win this battle.
Well, it's an amazing story. It really is. So I really do recommend our listeners. There's a link to Giles's book. Now, I just wanted to mention a couple other things because, Giles, you're a bit of a master at podcasts anyway, aren't you? You have your own one, Unknown History, so I recommend everyone head to that. You've just done an episode, haven't you, or last month?
Oh, no, it's a bit of a while ago, actually, since I did. It was actually when the book came out in America. We had a launch, a big set of episodes there. So people can listen to that. Anyway, as you say, Unknown History, you'll get a lot more about Berlin there. Okay, great. And then something's happening soon this year. You've written a book on Smyrna in 2020, about 1922. Yes, well, of course, it's the 100th anniversary of the destruction of Smyrna. Now, a lot of people will say, what is the destruction of Smyrna? Where is Smyrna? Smyrna was the most cosmopolitan, tolerant, and importantly, majority Christian city in the Middle East. It is nowadays Izmir on the west coast of Turkey. In 1922, it was Smyrna. And this became the battleground for a massive battle between the Greeks and the Turks. The Greeks, supported by the West heavily, particularly by the British and British weaponry. The Greeks, of course, had invaded Asia Minor and were trying to claim back vast areas of land in Asia Minor for the Greeks, re-establishing, if you like, the old Byzantine Empire. And the Greeks were eventually defeated, and the Greek army was pushed back to this great city, this incredibly cosmopolitan city full of Europeans, Americans, Greeks, Armenians, Turks, what have you. And my book tells the story, the appalling story of the sack of Smyrna by the Turkish army, while watched on by 23 Allied battleships in the Bay of Smyrna, who did nothing to prevent the first great humanitarian catastrophe of the 20th century. So it's a very, very powerful story. It's a story of refugees, of displaced people, of a terrible war, not dissimilar to what we're seeing in Ukraine at the moment.
It's interesting. Do we get the Treaty of Lausanne a year later?
We do, and that's where you get the first great shift of populations, where it's decided to uproot all the ethnic Greeks in Turkey, several million of them, and move them back to Greece, and move the Turks, the many ethnic Turks who live in Crete and elsewhere in Greece, and ship them over to Turkey. So this is deemed to be a solution. Of course, it ruins millions of people's lives. And of course, this great cosmopolitan city, this tolerant city, is burnt to the ground. There's nothing left of Smyrna at the end of September 1922. So it's a sort of salutary tale. And as you say, it's the 100th anniversary coming up. And certainly in Greece and possibly in Turkey, it will be marked and commemorated for the sort of profound effect it had on both of those nations.
So that's coming out again in October, is that right?
That's coming. It's in September. Is going to be the celebrations, and the book is available. Yes, absolutely.
Right. Okay, well, I'll make sure there's a link in there for that as well. Giles, thank you very much for your time. It's been so interesting, and the book is just brilliant.
Well, thank you very much for having me on. Thanks.
Giles Milton's book on Smyrna, Paradise Lost, you see what he's done there? Is out now, along with his latest, Checkmate in Berlin. I've put links we discussed, including maps of the divided Berlin and Germany in the wake of the war, in the show notes. Coming up next week, we have a Queen's Jubilee special, and I'm very lucky to have Tessa Dunlop return to discuss new material in her paperback, Army Girls. And she gives the lowdown on the Queen, or Princess Elizabeth as she was, and her experience in the army during the war, so please do join me then. If you can subscribe or give me a nice review, I'd be so pleased. But for now, thank you and good night.